I like film. It's really a childhood love. Well, I guess like I think a lot of professions or whatever, or hobbies, whatever people have, were generated in their childhood. And I loved movies as a child, and around 10 or so, I borrowed an uncle's 8mm camera and began to make films. And I had another friend, we made some films together, and one of them I still have. One is called a Bend in the River, which now I realize is a reference to an Anthony Mann Western, which was out at that time, and I didn't realize I had borrowed the title. I think we just changed one word unconsciously or something. And that was a film about animals in the neighborhood. I mean, besides, the blue jays, the squirrels.
This was in Brooklyn?
No, actually in New Jersey, about a half an hour outside of Manhattan. Turtles in the stream and so forth. I had been very taken at that age by the Disney natural, what are they called? Natural, not wildlife films. I forget what they were called. Things like Beaver Valley, Nature's Half Acre. I don't even know if you know these films. They were, I guess, the first nature films of that type, with a score and a narration, and basically they were films which went through the 4 seasons usually in a certain area, and you saw the species in a certain area, during the winter, during the spring, and I think it's the first time I ever saw, for instance, a time-lapse photography. Let's say flowers growing. There was something about them which struck me. In a way, I realize now that they were not films, though they had characters in them, the animals were characters, they were really poems, or in a sense, or essays, maybe in a Thoreauian sense. And they were also slightly homemade in a certain kind of way. They were probably shot in 16mm and blown up. And I think if one saw one today, one would realize what was done in a studio and slipped in, and I mean, those seams would be rather apparent. They weren't at that time. And I also, of course, loved the movies that most children love. I was very crazy about John Ford. I remember seeing Stagecoach for the first time. I think I was in 5th grade. My parents were driving across the country, and we stopped in Reno on the way to San Francisco. And in Harold's Club, which, a big gambling casino, they had a place where you could leave your children while the parents gambled, and they had there were free movies, free Coke, free hamburgers, free French fries. As a child, you couldn't believe this. Why was this going on? You didn't realize that they wanted the parents to relax and spend
more money.
Spend more money. But I remember they had a 16mm projector in the room. There were other kids there from around the country, and a fellow put on Stagecoach. And I was sort of blown away by it, by its tenderness. I had loved Westerns, but I'd never seen one that had both this kind of masculine aspect and feminine aspect, to use a rather old-fashioned language for dichotomy. But, for instance, there was a pregnant woman in it, something I'd never seen in a Western, certainly. There was an incredible amount of tenderness and care. Of course, the light was very, very beautiful. The sense of manliness was very strong, but it wasn't a kind of macho manliness. It was a kind of depth of clarity and wisdom in the male aspect. So in a way that both the feminine and the two aspects of being human, I found very, full. And I remember my parents came back and I said, I just saw the best movie I've ever seen. Started to tell them about it and so forth. And then I continued to be a fan of his. Now I think my own tendencies at first, as I say, were more humble. They were more like in the Disney thing, of sort of making nature films. Though we did block out. I remember there's a whole film we blocked out and shot, and didn't ever edit, which was based on the silent films. I forget, those serials where sort of a woman would be on a sawmill head. I forget what they were called.
Perils of Pauline.
Yeah, the Perils of Pauline kind of thing, the silent films. And we did a whole thing. And I remember, people running down a hill chasing someone. And I think this was at a time, I mean, at this point.
This was what, in the 50s?
Yeah, this is like, I guess, so I was at the most 10, so it was 1953, you know. And it isn't like now. I mean, now you go down the street and every skateboarder has their boyfriend or girlfriend, you know, lying on the ground with a video camera, you know, shooting endless leaps, you know, and so forth. It was, I think, a more unusual kind of thing, but it was a deep love. And I still remember it used to take a month to get film back from, you had to send it to Rochester. You know, it was Kodachrome 1, which was 10 ASA. It was very hard to expose, you know, like under trees, I remember.
And this was 8mm.
8mm. And it took a month to get it back. So there was a month pregnancy, so to speak, with each run. Finally it would come back and, you know, take it down the cellar and you'd pull down the shades and thread up the projector, and there'd be that smell of the projector bulb getting hot with the dust on it. You know, projector bulbs still do that. Some of them have that kind of smell, which is I sort of like. And look at your footage, and then try things like, I remember I had footage of people diving, and I mean, I'd never seen these Reifenstahl films, but you know, I said, well, let's see what it would look like backwards. And at that time, the 8mm projectors wouldn't go backwards, and because it was single perf, you couldn't thread it through the other way. So I remember turning the projector upside down, you know, holding it upside down so you could see it, you know, and stuff. So I think it was a very natural kind of love of the medium, and which I then carried, you know, into adolescence, and it dissipated slightly during adolescence because one got preoccupied with being an adolescent, which is rather overwhelming. And then when I was in college, which I only went for a year, there was a film club. This was at Antioch in Yellow Springs. There was a sort of a filmmakers club, and they had a Cine 16 camera and a Pro Junior tripod, and I saw some people using it one day, and it just, like, you know, something just went off, and I asked them if I could take a tutorial, and I think I left school a year later. I realized just to be rather out with my camera than, you know, hearing lectures in school, and went to New York and started to work in the film industry to make a living, you know, and then. And when I went to New York, when I was, what, 19 or 20, I began to see the experimental film that was being shown in New York, because at that point, 1963, I guess, 62, 63, it was like this very burgeoning, it was the hot ticket in town. If you were, you know, if you were a cutting edge, if you were a youth, it was really what was happening.
To go to Cinema 16? Or
well, Cinema 16 was already then considered old guard. It was considered the world of the theatrical, surrealistic, sort of melodrama kind of filmmaking, which actually I sort of like now in a way. I mean, everything sort of, you know, age, certain thing ages well. It's one of my, what do you call it, guilty pleasures. I like films where a man is pursuing a woman through landscapes and there's classical music playing. I mean, everyone's made one of those films. I mean, Brakhage, his first film was made, I forget what it was called, underneath, you know, and going through Denver, and I don't know, Anger has his own versions. You could even say that Odar de Fils is an aspect of that. I don't know, I like the, I don't know, there's something, well, and Markopoulos' early films, which, I mean, really early ones I love from the 40s. I think before he got into his montage theory, which I don't know if it really worked out, so to speak, for my own taste, though I was very affected by him. So anyway, I saw all these films, and you saw them at midnight, like at the Bleecker Street. There's this famous series of screenings at midnight. Stan Brakhage came and showed Dog Star Man Part 1, premiere. 2, 3, and 4 hadn't been made. Prelude had been made. Jack Smith showed Flaming Creatures, things like that. Gregory was showing Twice a Man before he had money to put sound on it. So, which I liked very much as a silent film. I almost preferred it because it was more ambiguous. You know, you weren't being told as much. And then also his cut-up use of sound was a little odd, I thought, sometimes. Well, I had friends from Antioch, especially a friend named Michael Middeke, who's a very nice filmmaker. And it was interesting, walking around the Art Institute here yesterday, I said, my gosh, this is what we used to do on our own, you know, living in a loft together. You know, in other words, you know, we'd be looking at films, working on our films. It's almost, because I never went to art school, it's a little bit almost surreal for me to see what was being done in sort of in the realm of being outlaws, right? In the realm of an institution. You know, you go into a noble building and there are people, you know, looking at the films and so forth. And it's a little odd. I don't say it's necessarily bad at all. I don't mean that. I just mean from the point of view of my own experience. And so that's one thing, is it was very much an outlaw reality. You know, I mean, the idea that flaming creatures or anything would be taught in a school, you know, is a humorous. Of course, at that time, we'd get stoned and go to westerns and stuff like that on 42nd Street, and sometimes we joke around that maybe there'll be a college course sometime, like on the western, you know, or you know, on, you know, and of course that everything that you joked about as a 20-year-old pothead became actually true. As a serious reality. Well, what happened is seeing Stan's work, seeing Gregory's work. I think Stan and Gregory were particularly strong for me, and amongst other people, is that I realized here was a school of filmmaking where you could make your own film, where it was a first-person film. It wasn't a third-person film. In other words, though Gregory films were like George Kuchar's films, of course, are third-person films in some sense, they're characters going through, you know, going through problems which may be resolved or not. But all of a sudden I realized that you could make a first-person film. You were a poet. It was your vision of the world. You know, it was almost like any tradition of poetry. You didn't have to have the ability to work with, you didn't have to have dramatic skills, you know, working theatrically and so forth, or narrative, you know, dramatic skills. But it had to do with using cinema itself as a means of expression. And the more I saw this, the more I realized that the filmmakers I loved most were those who seemed to be developing some kind of film language that was intrinsic to maybe what film itself was as a language, rather than using film to, let's say, represent theater or represent surrealism or represent graphics or painting or represent music or represent poetry even, let's say, which might have been more the Cinema 16 sense of things. But the people I really loved were trying, I felt, struggling to find a film language which in itself was a model of existence. In other words, the way we move through these shots and cuts is in a way going to open up, you know, mystery, devotion, respect, appreciation, you know, for what is going on, which of course none of us can really quite explain. So that really lit my fire, so to speak. And my first film I made, and I went out and made a film in that tradition in a way, sort of, you know, it's sort of odd in a way. It's like marketing yourself in a certain way for a certain way, but then, I mean, that was the initial impulse, but then it became something real. I made a film called In Green. I don't think you've seen it. Made in 1964. I made a trilogy about my childhood, the troubling sense of sexuality. This is a suburban town I lived in. There are 3 films. That I just saw them recently in San Francisco. Some young people had me show the 3 of them along with a more recent film.
And these were made in the mid-60s?
64 and 65. I made 3 of them in 1 year. And they're very, very strong. They're sound films. And I think in terms of what you were asking about, I think they address more my emotional life and so forth. And I was surprised. I hadn't seen them in 20 years or so, 25 years, and I saw the 3 of them, and they were very beautiful. I was, you know, it was, you know, a nice surprise. That summer, Jonas was having a series at what was called the Washington Square Gallery on
Jonas Mekas.
Yeah, Jonas Mekas. And that was where the so-called Cinematheque, whatever you want to call the venue was, that he would be covering in The Voice every week. And I premiered my film In Green. Well, I had Jonas over. Wait, I should say before that, I was living with 3 or 4 other people. We were sort of like squatters, like they do in London now, or they did or something, where some house was being sold and we were just all living there making films. And I made this film In Green. It took me 4 weeks to make it. I just conceived it, shot it. One of the people in our little group was working the midnight shift at the Technicolor lab in Manhattan. That was also at that point processing Kodachrome. He just stapled up the rolls, you know, shot them through on the run for nothing. I had gotten the rolls. A lot of them were out Oh, two of the rolls in that film are regular 8 used as 16 millimeter. I mean, not shot with 16 millimeter cameras, just with the extra perfs. Those were 2 rolls. I had one the year before when I was 19, the teenage movie contest, I think it's called. I had made a film about my mother's daycare center, about children and experimental art and so forth. You know, just a black and white sort of industrial, and won the teenage movie contest. And what was their generous award was 2 rolls of 8 millimeter color. So it was the first rolls of color I had shot since I was a kid. Anyway, so anyway, that film had Jonas come over. At that time, things were much more accessible and sort of rarefied, and he came over, loved the film, wrote about it in The Voice in a very praiseworthy way. Not a big mention, but you know, maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs. And I showed it, and Gregory was there, Ken Kelman, who was a very important writer at that period of time, someone who later on became a person I've known all my life. Jerome Heiler was there. That's where I met him. And that's how it all started. And then I made them more, and it grew from there. What I mean by devotional is that if we, in a sense, are sort of microcosms, I feel. I mean, we human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, as they say, are microcosms for something larger, which is the whole thing. And we are ourselves, our experience is somewhat of a microcosm for something, for the whole thing. That's sort of our position in a way. And that I feel that if you can make a devotional work as a work, you know, in any medium, from any period of time, going back to, let's say, 30,000 years ago in the cave art to, you know, something being done today, that a devotional work is something which quiets the person, stirs the person, arranges their metabolism, so to speak, in such a way that their sense of themselves as a microcosm unites with the larger thing, which they're also part of. So that, in a sense, the genius of the creation, so to speak, to use just to use the word creation, the genius of this situation. I mean, the genius that we're existent, you know, or that there's a planet and sun and that we're existent. The genius of that, which is, you know, extreme, you know, if you think about it. One's own genius as a Homo sapien, those two geniuses, you know, the doorway between them opens, and that's where the devotion is. If you know what you're being devoted to, then in a way you're not opening the door. In other words, the devotion is actually opening the door between yourself and something larger than yourself, which are the same. You could call it opening, but I know devotion in modern times is not a word which is normally used, or, you know, and certainly devotion itself became distorted in Western history at a very early period of time. I mean, the devotional painting from 1500 on is the sentiment of devotion, and is basically mostly bullshit in terms of its what it's representing. Maybe not in terms of what it achieves visually, but in terms of what it's representing, it's, you know, not genuine, you know.
So in terms of your own films, how does this manifest itself, this devotion?
Well, I think it has to do with trying to use images, or trying to use the screen in a way as a, you could say, as an altarpiece. I don't mean to, I mean, these words may get me in trouble, you know, I mean, if people want to go with them the wrong way or something. But using the screen as something to sit in front of, and making the screen and what happens with the quality of the screen and what happens with the cuts. Because as I say to you, for me, you know, it's something, of course, the Russians have been talking about since the teens, right? I think the Russians talked about it a lot, but actually didn't manifest it very much. I mean, Vertov manifested it momentarily, I think, in Man with a Movie Camera. And then there's a lot of stuff which is, for me, not working at all. You know, maybe 80% of the film doesn't work, but 20% is a real is real brilliant. And Eisenstein talked about it all the time, but I don't think he actually manifested it. We talked about it beautifully, took beautiful stills, you know, and so forth, from my own point of view. But at any rate, so the point of what I'm leading to is shots and cuts are the sort of the pith, yin and yang of the filmmaking. I mean, that's what film is. How does it get from, and, you know, unless it's a one-shot, you know, a one-shot film, you know, Sleep or something, or a, you know, a 30-year long film of a tree growing or something like that. I mean, normally a film is a progression of shots and cuts. So from my point of view, that's what we have to work with. In other words, for an intrinsic film language, a film language which can use film itself to be as some kind of model, a healthy model of existence, right? That model has to employ the basic sort of skeletal aspects of film, which are shots and cuts. That's just my own feeling about it. So that what a shot has to be and what a cut has to be has to have this devotional quality. What I mean by that is that for a shot to have devotional quality, it has to understand, it has to not take seeing for granted. Right? You have to understand that you are seeing, that you, in the sense that you, in my own experiences, in the midst of darkness, are seeing vision. In other words, in the sense that your skull is dark like a movie theater, and vision is taking place. That in the midst of darkness, light is taking place. That this light isn't everywhere. It's somehow this light is resting on the surface of your mind, where your mind is interacting with phenomena and experiencing light. You know, you're just you're nowhere resting on this interconnection with the world, just resting on light. So I think it's important that the shots have to have a quality where the screen has the nobility of being a very benign container, the way that you yourself as a being contain what you see. So it has to contain the nobility and dignity of the container has to be there, and then what it contains can't be other than the container. So if you're using the screen to look at the world outside of you, that wouldn't have a devotional quality. But it's when the container is also what is seen. The two things come together. The person or the shot that's containing, and what they're seeing becomes the icons, becomes what they see. When all that unites. This is, I mean, similar in painting and so forth. It isn't, you know, unique to film and so forth. I mean, this goes through all media. It's not particularly something to the avant-garde film. I mean, Ford, for instance, we were talking about earlier, you know, has an extraordinarily beautiful sense of how to use the square on the wall, how to use that square, how to use the tension of light to give you a cosmic sense that this is human beings on a planet. You know, these are activities of human beings on a planet. He's not taking for granted. It's not being turned into a verbal or dialogue reality. The dialogue is an ornament to the basic poetic impulse, which is a respect for the situation. In the last, 30 years, have made two kinds of film. One is a film that has to deal with an exploration of a single subject. And one was on film grain, one was on sand, one was on hand processing. Actually, there's another one using AA camera, 17 Reasons Why. So in a way, some of them were an exploration of a single subject, so to speak. Those 17 Reasons Why is both a single subject of a AA projection and multiple imagery. And then the other area seemed to be this kind of thing which was just going around and taking pictures of things in the sense of trying to find a tapestry, try to create a tapestry of what it felt like in the world right now. And sometimes those films would be more descriptive of the time that they were in. I don't mean au courant stuff, I just mean, or sometimes they were a little bit more of a specific mood that I was in. But it takes me a long time to collect. This year, right now, I'm hopefully going to finish a film that I shot in 1 year, in 14 months maybe. Up until this point, because I got way behind myself, my shooting got way, way ahead of my editing. I got very blocked at a certain period of time. And so for about 10 years, I didn't make a movie. That's why I don't have a career. and so that, at any rate, it took me a long time. I was editing film footage I had collected, always in the past, and not up until Variations did I actually make a film in the present tense, where I was shooting and cutting. But anyway, I collect and I collect various things which seem to me that have some kind of poignancy to them, and with as great a variety as possible.
And you collect them in the world. You don't set up shots. You move around with your camera and pull out your camera to film. I mean,
on the whole, but on the other hand, it also seems that, like going through daily life, there are times when you're sitting having coffee with a friend, right? So then I try to include even things like that. You know, that suddenly you'd be with someone you knew. It wouldn't be just someone you happened to see on the street, right? It would be also, well, whatever percentage of the day you might spend. You know, if you spend a day alone, there might be an hour during the day where all of a sudden you're having coffee, or I'm just using that as an example. We're sitting around with someone you know, and then that has that kind of reality. So I tried to even include portraiture, in a sense, of people who I knew and would actually be relating to the camera. So I tried to include everything that I experienced. I mean, I try to push myself beyond subject matter that I normally felt comfortable with, you know, and so forth. But at the same time, the trick in filmmaking is that you have, at least from my point of view, is filmmaking involves translating life experience onto the screen. I remember when I first started to make films, when I was 10 or 11, that was a shocking idea. I realized that I'd seen all these films I liked, and then there was the world out there, and then all of a sudden I had to shoot it in a way to make it into a movie. And that translation is quite, is what you spend your life learning. How do you translate the randomness of everything into the container of a film and still capture some of the liveliness of that? So I obviously choose things which I feel, when I photograph, will translate onto the screen, which will make the screen look good. So I have to make the screen look good as well as something I'm interested in. I mean, it could be, many times I see something which is wonderful, I say, no, it won't work on the screen. It's not going to, somehow it won't work when you photograph it. There are a lot of things that are also subtly already media, and if you take pictures of them, they become secondary. Well, I don't know if it's anything else that when I'm walking along, and the tension of the light in a situation, the poignancy of what's going on in terms of the meaning of what's going on, all of a sudden, let's say the 5 or 6 elements which all have to be there, that it's photographable. I'm not going to get punched. That it's that the light has the right kind of tension that's going to make the particular stock I have in the camera relate to it well. That there's a certain kind of poignancy about, oh, this is a little bit of what it feels like to be alive today. My own style is not to go toward anything ultra specific. In other words, I don't want to create an image which becomes a symbol of something. Like now there's, let's say, homeless people on the street. In other words, I don't want to take. I try not to take images which the media has already used so thoroughly that they don't have any kind of sense of direct, discovery by the viewer. They already become like symbols.
They're not like over-determined, their meanings.
Yes, right. So yes, if you take an image to me where your concept or your language can immediately fill in, and that there's no longer, a continual present relationship with the image on the screen, it becomes a representation of something, then I wouldn't do it. Or I do it sometime and I realize I failed.
Is there are you filming thematically? I mean, do you have a certain idea of where you're going as you're collecting these images, or is it just whatever grabs you? And
well, it changes. Well, with that film Triste we showed, I mean, even probably a terrible title, but I can't do anything about it now. I'm not going to, but that I was actually interested in trying to see how much, if I could actually make a silent film that was about sadness, without it being about, let's say, showing an individual on a dramatic level going through something sad, you know, or seeing someone in a very, you know, decrepit state, you know. But I just meant if I could you know, see things, you know, be at a baseball game, you know, whatever, be in a rainy night, somehow just get a certain kind of pathos, you know. And so that was sort of what I was sort of pushing myself in that direction. And I would try to feel things which represented to me in that film, a certain kind of desolate quality I was feeling as a very much an outsider in society. And, you know, it was during, as I said, during the Reagan years, and I don't know, the country was being sold out to the rich. You know, you realized that things are, you know, the bottom was coming out, and, you know, and there's all this propaganda that that wasn't what was happening, but it was happening. And, you know, just feeling left out. And so that kind of quality. Then with variations, for instance, came out of trying to shoot some, I tried to cut trees for 5 or 6 years. I shot it for 15 years. I mean, around 3 or 4 other films. And I hadn't shot in 5 years because I had been editing. And I went to shoot just some additional shots, just a few bridges I might be able to get. And I went to use my Bolex, and I realized I was a different person. I got back the first roll. This footage looked so different. And so, I mean, you know, it was completely different.
You couldn't use it in Trieste.
Yeah, I used 2 or 3 things, which I just snuck in for a moment. I mean, I could actually show, you know, when we looked at the film, there were like 3 shots, which just momentarily I could sneak in. But for one thing, I had decided I was through with using a zoom lens. I wanted to just use prime lenses. I wanted to hold the camera. I was always afraid to hold the camera. Like in Trieste, it's mostly all on a tripod with a zoom lens. And then I started to get...
Variations is all handheld?
All handheld.
That's so interesting, because
yeah.
It seemed it's the opposite in a way.
Well, you know, I mean, of course, sometimes I would set the camera down on a ledge. If there was something self-existent, I might, you know, rest the camera against a lamppost or, you know, something to help steady it if that was important. But I realized that I had been embarrassed to use my body, you know, part of my own kind of self-hatred in that way from childhood and stuff. In the film, I didn't want my body to become part of the film, so the film was a little disembodied, you know. And so I wanted all of a sudden to actually not be, you know, include my own body. And so then I went to shoot, right? Actually, what happened? I went to start to take film, and it was like very unpleasant to put a camera up to my face and start to look at the world, because it sort of separates you from everything. I started to get that really horrible feeling I used to get of what it's like to take a picture of something. You see something you want, and you try to take a good picture of it, and you feel awful. I don't know, it only makes you more distant. You know, like the, you know how diabolical, let's say, a news crew looks, you know, with their Betacam on their shoulder and, you know, interviewing somebody about something. You know, it's just like nightmarish, you know, horrifying. But the thing is that, so I started to get that feeling again, and I said, well, wait a minute, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong that this is so awful for me? And why am I even doing it? George Kuchar once said to me, if you don't have you might as well have a good time making these films. Why make them? If you're not enjoying yourself making them, you know, because you're not going to get anything out of it, you know, except this interview, you know what I'm saying? So at any rate, so I realized that I was going about looking through the camera all wrong. That I had been like an insecure B student all my life in a certain way. In other words, I saw something I wanted to shoot, and then I go, oh, I'm going to take a good shot of that. And then I would try to take a good shot of what I had seen. Right? That like fell apart for me. Right?
Between Trieste and very...
Yeah. It's just like I couldn't do that anymore. It was too painful. And all of a sudden I realized that I was going to forget all my codified ideas of what you had to do to make a film that was acceptable within the avant-garde. I mean, there's certain emotions that aren't allowed. There's certain senses of beauty which aren't allowed. Not allowed, but are not, you know, not considered kosher. You know, certain emotions, you know what I'm saying. Alienation. I can list the things which are considered very part of the, yes, this is an avant-garde film. Oh, no, that's not an avant-garde film because it doesn't have that, you know, sense of things, right? So, anyway, I put the camera up to my face, and I decided I'd go back right to the beginning, like the film I was talking about. and I was walking in Golden Gate Park near my house, and I was going to take some pictures of some ducks swimming. You know, I'm just going to go right back to the beginning, right? Mm. And the ducks were on this beautiful water. You know how gorgeous a mallard is. You know, they're just so, you can't believe how well dressed they are, you know. And they're just moving along on the surface of the water. And I put the camera up, and instead of trying to take a good picture of them, right, I put the camera up and began to enjoy the viewfinder itself. In other words, I stayed in the present tense with the camera in front of me, so that when I was in the finder, I didn't have this project like a B student trying to get an A, right? It wasn't that. It was like I was just going to enjoy the finder and make the finder beautiful. Obviously, if the finder is beautiful, the screen is beautiful. If the screen is beautiful, then the audience is having the same experience I'm having enjoying the finder. So it was a way to unite me, the finder, the screen, and the audience all clicked into one thing. There's no duality going on. So I began to enjoy the finder and try to move and use the finder in a way that was sublime. And move the finder in a way that was not my trying to make a camera move, which of course in any genre of film is a weak move, but where the finder itself moved because the finder itself, it was sublime for the finder to change what it was, rather than it was my using the finder as a mode to contact the outside world. So there's a huge collapse of this big obstacle, and I think that's one of the reasons people like Variations. It has this kind of joy and passion. And for the first time, since I was a child, I was willing to let my joy, my passion, my love of things, you know, determine what I was going to photograph. That didn't mean it didn't include some sense of pathos and how can you know, I mean, that's everything. I'm a sad person like anybody. I'm as doubtful and insecure and as confident as anybody. I sort of, like anyone, have those double qualities, being doubtful but completely confident. I'm confident only because I'm willing to say this is what this is what means something to me, right? That's where my confidence comes from. This means something to me. I know this means something to me, right? It isn't like I'm trying to do something to impress somebody. Then I wouldn't have any real confidence. You know, you'd be hoping. You know what I'm saying? But I say, I know this means something to me. I'm alive. I'm a being. This means something to me. Maybe there's a chance it means something to someone else, right? But at least you have the confidence that it really does mean something to you. And like, for instance, like with Variations, I didn't know until it was shown. I had no idea if it was there or not. I mean, I knew I loved it in the context of my apartment, but I had no idea, you know, just no idea. So, but at any rate, so what that means is that I felt that and this is something I've been thinking about since the 1960s. Part of it came from reading John Ashbery in the 1960s, you know, American poet, and various other things. I began to wonder in the mid-60s what it would be like to make a film where every movement from every shot to every shot, not as a conceptual thing. This isn't something where you couldn't be free to break the rule and, you know, be human and adjust to the needs of the film. But what would happen if every shot, if the move from one shot to the other, every move within the film was in itself some kind of opening, some kind of grand opening from one subject to another. You know, this had been, as I said, momentarily done in two small areas of Man with a Movie Camera. You know, I think Cornell tried it, but unsuccessfully in a way, from my own point of view, let's say in Thimble Theater and things like that. Not unsuccessfully, but it's more like surrealism. This is an odd series of juxtapositions. There's a beautiful sequence at the end of Heart of London, you know that film? Mm-hmm. You know, I think where it goes into that kind of montage, where after the birth, and we finally arrive on Earth after about 50 minutes, and then we're around the whole section with the slightly autistic kid and the parrot and the people growing flowers under the umbrellas, and I think all of a sudden that film blossoms into the most beautiful open-ended montage. I mean, you know, brilliant movie, you know. there's indications that this had been done, and then also Jerome Hyler, my good friend, who's a very great filmmaker, in the mid-'60s, began to show rolls in his apartment. This is around the time I made that trilogy. And it's the first time I realized that there was this possibility from what he was doing with his own rolls, cut original and showing them, that there's a possibility to make a film that where the actual movement through the film was the reality. In other words, the film wasn't trying, like a coloring book, so to speak, trying to fill in some concept. Like, I'm going to make a film about early childhood, or I'm going to make a film about the tortures of this, or I'm going to, or even a subtle concept. It wasn't that. There was no umbrella that the visual language was filling in. Even, Gregory's films were very much, even though they're very visually alive, were under this umbrella of a dramatic necessity, even though it was a fragmentation of dramatic necessity. So this didn't have to do with fragmentation or deconstruction of anything already established. It had to do with the actual, could a film blossom in itself, out of itself? Could it continue just to blossom openly? Wouldn't that be amazing? Your whole psyche could go into play. Everything in you, your passion, your anger, your sublime sense of gentleness, your irony, your humor, all that makes you enjoyable and anyone else enjoyable as a human being could just start to blossom out of the film. The film had no agenda. In a way, it was like I felt like the film was being let out of school. It's like when you're a kid in the springtime and you got out of school and you could walk in the woods, take your penknife or whatever and, carve sticks and, play in a stream. It was sort of like that for me. It was like, oh, I'm just going to let this thing bloom. I'm not in control of it. Right?
So how are you doing that when you're at the level of cutting?
So how I'm doing that is that what I actually do is I move my material around. Almost anything that I try to do myself in this area is corny. I mean, I feel that I'm the dumb one. When I'm making a film, the images, I sort of have an enjoyable time with the images. I feel they're waiting for me to realize who they are. It's almost like they're the children, I'm the parent, right? The parent had a certain preconception of what they wanted the child to be, right? The child is begging for the parent to understand who they actually are outside of their concept. Even though they respect the child, in a way they still say, no, the child should be this, right? So I feel like I'm trying to be a good parent, if not to the images, and not even a parent at a certain point, more like a consort. I sort of let them take the lead. They're the ones who are intelligent. I'm the one who's stupid. The intelligence is in the material, right? So what I try to do is move the material around, and my own attempts to move the material around are sometimes successful, and the serendipitous things that happen moving the material around are equally successful. And I try things, and I project, and suddenly a cut will happen, which is totally nurturing to me, a complete surprise. I go, yow, wonderful. I don't know what the cut means, but it's completely visually beautiful, and more importantly, it stirs something in me poetically. You go, in other words, it brings forth my own sense of presence, my own sense of isness. You go, amazing, right? And so I'll get one cut to work that way, and then it grows out of that. Now, as I'm moving the footage around, for instance, like in Variations, suddenly 2 or 3 other shots will start to make a little bit of a phrase, which has that kind of magic, and I'll just put them over here. And what happened with Variations is various phrases began to grow, almost like a pond freezing over. Molecules began to grow, like organic molecules, in various areas, right? And then in looking at those molecules, so to speak, you perceive that this molecule should happen about 80% through the film. This is near the beginning. If this happened near the beginning, it would be too much. Let's say, for instance, the Tai Chi and the softball player. That you can't have that in the first 8 minutes of a movie. It's much too much of a theater piece almost. It has to happen way down the line. I feel like they're the sheep, not sheep, but sheep has always that pejorative. They're like sheep. I don't mean that, but I mean like if I'm a sheepdog and they're sheep.
So you're a shepherd.
I'm a shepherd. Yes. I'm like or a sheep. Yeah, more like a shepherd. In other words, they have their own reality. They're the ones who are alive and you know, but occasionally they're like gonna, you can realize that I mean, you do realize as a shepherd that some areas, that this should be near the beginning of the film, not for any codified reason.
But okay, but that's such a humble image, you know, that being a shepherd, and that you have that sense of authorship and the sense of your own, the idea of producing your own sensibility, which after all is quite present in in these films. They're definitely, you know, Nick Dorsky films. So in some ways, while you're talking about being a shepherd, at the same time you're exerting a very strong sensibility over these works, no?
But no, it's a double-edged thing. In other words, since I knew I took every shot, right, and that these shots, the shots I've chosen to work with are shots which I feel go all the way for me. And I use this term like the back of the screen falls out. I mean, I can take a very good shot, which in a sound film would be, you know, as good as, you know, one of the better shots in some sound film. But in my film, when you look at it, it remains like something that's been photographed, right? Every once in a while, I'll take a shot, and the back of the screen falls out. The shot is timeless. You just become the shot. You're not like watching the shot. It's just like you become the shot. So I gather those into a corral, so to speak, into a few reels. And I trust the fact that there is a through line, because I assume my sensibility's already been there, right? But then they're not organized based on my sensibility. I don't feel I have to add my sensibility. It's already there. It's sort of like I'm already myself. In other words, you know how you know people who are like have become caricatures of themselves? You know what I mean? Or they believe in some media version of themselves. You know, on this, you know, whatever the pose, you know. It's like, that's what I mean. You don't have to add, you're already there. So I figure I'm already there. It's already, so it isn't a false, when I say I'm like a shepherd, I don't mean that as in any kind of false sense of humbleness. I mean, being a shepherd allows this, you know, the depth, the sublime, the magic. In other words, I feel limited. My ideas are quite limited. Do you know what I'm saying? But the ideas that existence brings forth are bigger than mine. And so that I try to, in a way, shepherd things which are more than I have to offer. Constructing it in cooperation with, in service to what the material presents as exciting. In other words, I'm letting the material take the lead. It's more brilliant than I am. The serendipitous connections, which I, of course, then recognize. I mean, that's my job as the shepherd, right? I appreciate and thank the material for, and move around with it. So it's very much what do you call it when two people work on a work together? Collaboration. Definitely, I do not feel I'm working alone. I definitely feel it's a definite collaboration with the material, very actively so. I thank the material. I don't mean self-consciously, you know. There might be a shot which I couldn't get to work for a long, long time, and then suddenly two shots and I come together that actually make that shot enter the film beautifully, and I just, you know, I just sort of go, you know, just like that. I think for Eisenstein, who said that? Eisenstein said that about the. I mean, who takes better still? I mean, I'm not crazy about the movies myself because of their, I don't know, their agenda aspect. But who takes more beautiful stills? I mean, a still from an Eisenstein film is it's unbeatable, right? Caravaggio or something, you know. But so I mean, obviously they were trying to do something with their stills. What I'm saying is, all I'm saying is that both have to be players. In other words, if you had a concept that the shots were nothing and only the cuts were the manifestation of being or mystery or expression, then that would be a concept. Do you know what I'm saying? That the film would be that would be like a plan. No, I think that everything has to be there. The shot is, in a way, for me, sort of the accommodation, the thing which is the compassion, the thing that takes in and receives. The cut is more like something that has to do with like a blade. You know, in traditional Buddhist sculpture, you know, sometimes you'll see like a figure of Manjushri with a sword and a book, or other characters with a sword and a bell. I feel it's sort of like that, where the bell is like the shot, dong, you know, and then the sword cuts, absorption. In other words, the shot has to be needs to be fairly seductive, but then the cut has to cut the absorption into that seduction, cut it in a way that opens up newness or nowness for the audience. Do you know what I mean? In other words, if you made a cut which continues the absorption because it actually meaning takes over, then in a way, to me, it's like taking people out of the present moment. I mean, in a way, I'm sort of like a Japanese poet continuing the aspects of the ethos of the Marxist revolution. You know what I'm saying? I mean that on an aesthetic level. The idea of that you don't want to, or Brechtian, the whole idea that you don't want to lead the audience away. You want to bring you want to represent themselves to themselves. They're the stars of the movie. In short, it has to accumulate. And the way one does that is the cut has to break open, right? But what I've discovered is that the breaking open also has to resonate back. So in my own films, like if you watch Variations, what you don't realize, or actually all the way back to Hours for Jerome, which I made, I didn't edit until the late 70s, I discovered that you could create an interesting opening going from here, here to here, right? But that if this ricocheted back, had a synapse back, let's say 2 or 3 shots, that then, even though it was breaking open, an accumulation began to take place. It's sort of magical. It's the way people will say grandchildren are more like their grandparents than their parents. Do you know what I mean? There's some kind of leap. The parents are the cut from the grandparent to the grandchild, right? But there's actually more, you know what I mean, going back. So for instance, I mean, I know in all my films, I know when a shot works is not only is because it opens, right? If it just opened, the film wouldn't have any kind of accumulation. It would just it would be something breaking apart on itself, and it would just be sort of nihilistic and unpleasant. But it has to break open and resonate back. On a very simple level, a shot could have, for instance, in Trieste, there's a shot through a blue gel of a street, I don't know, tractor, whatever you call it, pulling up the pavement, pulling up the big area of pavement, shot through a blue gel. Then what? There's a shot, God, I don't know that film. Oh, then there's a shot of a black and white cloud against the sky with a little jump cut in it, which is supposedly a little raw humor about, because the pavement was just pulled and jerked up, and then you see and then it cuts to a woman in lying like this in blue sunglasses. I know from arranging the material that when you cut to her and she has these blue sunglasses on, that it means something to you. Why? Because 2 shots back, there was a blue gel shot. So I've discovered that there's in all the things that for the film to move through itself and accumulate, it has to break forward, but also unconsciously resonate back. Sort of trying to use certain principles of dream language, which are even talked about a lot in interpretation of dreams. Have you ever read that? Mm-hmm. I mean, just amazing things about how Freud talks about how you'll have a dream, image in your dream, and the dream image will actually, be retained as a shape on the inside of your eye, and then your eye, it'll morph. The inside of your eye, the shape will just sort of morph slightly, which will then actually create the next image in the dream. And they did all sorts of experiments with affecting the eyelids during dreaming, to show that the actual the eyelids and inside the eyelids, that morphing is actually adjusting the film language, the dream language. So in that sort of sense of that there is something, there's something emotive happening, and to what degree the film has an overall meaning or something, I wouldn't even think about that. That would only hurt the film. Like the film I just finished cutting, if I did finish cutting it, it's about 30 minutes long right now. I haven't really looked at it finished, so I'm not sure how long it'll end up being. But I was coming down the last slot of the film. There's about 4 minutes to go in it. And I had in my mind how it was going to end, right? So I built that ending and put it on the end of the film. It was so awful. It was so dull, so terrible. Why? Because it was something I conceived, right, as an ending. It had all to do with me and my own subtle sense of pride and vanity that I had an idea for how it would work. That vanity is so stupid and dumb compared to the pure open adventure of the film, that I just had to break it break it apart. It took a couple of weeks and let the film itself find its way to the end. I am simply trying to find a way that I can express my with a certain respect for the lineages of beauty that I've seen that go back to Chinese porcelains that I've been looking at from the 1100s, at the museum across the street, to anything, to express what means most to me. It's a very sort of childlike sense of childlike sense of, of rest, a place of, of rest, in the midst of everything.